Hi instructors, Professor Kim here, and I've got a board game for you that will work your students' logic, deduction, problem solving, and communication skills. It's great for the classroom because it encourages communication and observational skills. It is Deception. Thanks for joining me for this Board Games in the Classroom with Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. So to get started, I just want to give you an overview of the game and then talk about some of the basic strategies and techniques that you can employ to really pull out all of those basic skills that you want your students to explore and to practice during this game. So in this game, there is one particular person who's going to play the forensic scientist, and all of the roles are passed out face down, so you don't know who's going to get that role. And that player is going to essentially be feeding clues to everyone else at the table as to who the murderer is. Now, the murderer, unfortunately, is one of the investigators at the table. There has been a crime, and everyone at the table should be suspicious of their fellow investigators. That's where the observational skills and the deduction and the problem solving comes into play. And of course, there's going to be a lot of table talk and a lot of guessing and a lot of reasoning going on because players are trying to figure out which one at the table has the means and the clue in front of them that matches what the forensic scientist is giving clues for. It's all about which role you have and what part you're playing, and in this case there are three different roles. There's the murderer role. The murderer needs to deflect and throw suspicion and blame on other players without making it look obvious that they're the guilty one. And so they're going to try to sow discontent and question things and really try to play against the forensic scientist. The forensic scientist is trying to, in a very clear and organized way, give clues through just these boards. They're not allowed to talk to any of the investigators, and so their means of persuasion and their way of communicating with the investigators is simply through noting these general characteristics about the murdered person, about the location, about the means or what was in the same space with that particular person. And then lastly, most of the players at the table are going to be investigators, and they're going to be trying to suss out who this murderer is, and they're going to try to pay as much attention to what the forensic scientist is laying out for them. But they really just interact with each other because the forensic scientist is not allowed to speak, and they're not allowed to give any reactions that might give things away. And so investigators, that's where that critical thinking and problem solving and deduction and reasoning, they are really trying to pay attention. The murderer can't be too lazy either. They're always on the edge of their seat, listening to what everyone's doing and saying and trying to either encourage it if they're going down the wrong path, or they're going to try to fight against that if they think that they're getting closer to figuring out that they're the murderer. And so everyone's playing one of those three parts, and that's one reason why students like to play this again, is because they want to try it being someone else in the game and playing a different role, because it really works other skill sets and gets you thinking from a different perspective. So up next, I've got the student overview, which will go straight into that tutorial. I'll do a little bit of tips and suggestions, and then I'll wrap up the whole video by giving you a couple more suggestions and ideas for how to incorporate this into the classroom successfully. Hi students, you're playing Deception, Murder in Hong Kong today. This is a group game and you have a secret identity. So you might be playing the forensic scientist, an investigator, or you might be the murderer. This game requires that you pay close attention to what everybody else at the table is doing and saying. You need to really focus on detail and specifics, looking at everyone's clues and mean cards that are face up in front of them. I'll make sure that you get a close-up of that during our tutorial. And you need to be paying attention to what the forensic scientist is giving you as clues, because they are trying to communicate with you to help you find out who that murderer is. And if you're the murderer, you're going to want to throw people off your trail. The game is played over several rounds, of which the forensic scientists give clues, and everyone at the table, investigator and murderer, who's the secret identity, they are going to be talking and communicating with each other what they know and what they think and who they think the murderer is, and whatever your ideas and your suggestions are, you need to be very vocal and communicate those with the team. So there's a lot of talking in this game, and there's a lot of figuring out what you know and what you don't know. Towards the end of the game, players are going to start thinking that they have an idea of who the murderer is, but that's not enough. You need to know exactly what the means of the murder was and what the clue left at the scene of the murder is. If you can identify both of those pieces of information, you will win the game for the entire team of the investigators and the forensic scientist. If no one at the table can figure out who the murderer is by their means and the clue left at the scene, the murderer wins the game. Let's set the game up and start playing. Join me in the student tutorial next. So I've got the game set up for 5 players. There are 4 investigators, and there's the forensic scientist character over here. They essentially play a silent role, but talk through the use of these giant clue cards. Each character will receive 4 clue cards and 4 means cards that they place in front of them facing everyone else so it's easy to see. They also receive a badge token which allows them to make 1 guess during the game. And they also receive their secret identity card. These have all been shuffled up for a 5-player game. Look in the rulebook to see what your dynamic is for a larger game than 5. One of these 4 players, though, is the murderer. The other 3 are investigators. Once you have set up the board and passed out the identity cards, the forensic scientist will ask everyone to close their eyes, and the murderer will wake up and open their eyes, pointing at one of their blue cards and one of their red cards. That is the means of the death and the clue that was left at the scene of the murder. Once the forensic scientist knows who the murderer is and has identified the 2 cards, they ask the murderer to close their eyes and then wakes everyone up, keeping that murderer identity secret. No one at the table other than the murderer and the forensic scientist should know who the murderer is. The forensic scientist is going to shuffle up these 4 location cards and select one, placing it next to the cause of death card. Then they select 4 of these brown-backed scene cards. At this point, it is the forensic scientist's job to get the ball rolling with clues. They're going to take these markers and they're going to put it on one of the spaces on the card that makes the most sense. Was the cause of death suffocation, severe injury, loss of blood, illness or disease, poisoning, or an accident? Let's say our person places it on poisoning. Everyone at the table is going to look at everyone else's cards and say, plants could be poisonous. You could probably do it that way. Maybe it was a fork and knife. You fed someone poisoned food. And then this person, of course, is like, don't pick me. It's not me. I'm not the murderer. Look over here. There could be poison in that perfume bottle or a poison rose, just like all of the fantasy fairy tales. What about this dirty water? That looks pretty poisonous. And everyone's going to look around. Wow. This character has poisonous gas. That sounds pretty poisonous to me, but it could be a poison soap or a poison newspaper. Maybe there was some sort of poison on the cover of it, or someone blended up poison into a drink. Poisonous needle! This character is looking very, very suspicious. While everyone is talking at the table, that forensic scientist is still going down and marking new information that they leave as clues for everyone at the table. They mark pub as the location of the crime. The choices were pub, bookstore, restaurant, hotel, hospital, or building site. Now sometimes the forensic scientist just has to do their best. It may not fit one of these categories perfectly, and that's something the investigators need to keep in mind. At this point, they're going to flip over cards until they have made marks on each of these 6 cards. Now that all 6 of the clues have been given by the forensic scientist, everyone at the table is going to get a special moment, uninterrupted by any other player, to put forth their idea of who they think is the murderer and which 2 cards, red and blue, of the murderers they think is the right answer. This is not an official guess. This is just each player reasoning through their process of problem solving. So on my turn, if I wanted to talk about who I thought the murderer was and what the clue left at the scene was, and also the means, I'm going to say this player. And I'm going to say this player because I think the perfume might be a really big clue as to the smell. Noticed by the bystander is the smell. Perfume is very smelly, and so that to me is suspicious. And the amoeba and the dirty water I'm pretty suspicious about as the means by which the victim was murdered. Once everyone has made their theories public on who they think the murderer is and the means and clue, the forensic scientist will draw a new brown card and replace one of the 4 brown cards here with perhaps a better clue. So that's more information. Which of these 4 clues is the forensic scientist going to replace with this brand new one? This new card says time of death. Was it dawn, morning, noon, afternoon, evening, or night? There will be more communication and more talking at this point. The forensic scientist will draw another new brown card and replace one of the remaining 3, hopefully giving more information about the murder. At this point, it is up to players to use their badge to make an official full guess on the murderer, the means, and the clue which was left at the scene. Once a player makes a full guess, they say it out loud, and the forensic scientist will say yes if every single piece of information was correctly identified. If not, only partial, the forensic scientist says no. They don't say that you got half of it right. They simply say no. Once everyone has made a full guess, the game is over. If any of those guesses had been correct, the forensic scientist would say, yes, that's a correct guess, and the game is won immediately. But if that final guess goes and nobody guessed it correctly, the murderer wins. The thing you're going to enjoy the most about this game is talking to each other about your theories and really trying to suss out who you think the murderer is. Some people are going to be presenting pretty reasonable suggestions, so be really cautious about those logical steps that you think you're making and listen really well to everyone else. Definitely be on the lookout for a murderer who might be acting a little fishy. Your observational skills should be on high alert during this game because the forensic scientist can't really communicate with you verbally or physically. They're simply giving you clues based on these random cards that give you just a little bit of information, but in some cases they may not be as helpful as they want them to be. Make sure you make your guess count, because if you are trying to figure out who that murderer is, you get to make whatever argument you think makes the most sense, and if you're the murderer, like I was, you're really trying to throw people off your trail by pointing at all these other ridiculous things. If you're quiet in this game, you will not necessarily do as well as when you talk about your ideas with everyone else and reason through all of the assumptions that you're making about the clues given by the forensic scientist and who you think the other person at the table is who might be the murderer. You know your identity, and if you are an investigator, you want to work with the other investigators to share information and to share ideas, because everyone on the investigator team wins if they find out who the murderer is and you point to both of the cards that are the accurate means and clue left at the murder scene. Each game only lasts about 15 to 30 minutes, and if you can play again, shuffle up those hidden identity cards and see if you get to play a different role in your next game. Each role is going to ask for you to change your strategy just enough to make sure that your team successfully wins. Nearly every time I play Deception, everyone at the table says, I want to play this right away. I want to play it again. The reason I think they want to play this game over and over again is because they just enjoy that social aspect of the game, and I think not many games allow for this cooperation and teamwork where you're actually trying to deduce who might not be on your team. And it does so in a way that really benefits observation skills and people who pay attention to details. And so you're going to have a great time sharing this with your students, and I know they're going to have a great time learning it. If you want something that challenges your students a little bit more, there are a couple variants in the game. The first variant is to add or subtract means and clue cards by 1. And so you take away one of the clue cards and mean cards if you want to make it a little bit easier on the investigator, or you're going to add to the 4 and make it 5 for both the means and the clue cards to make it just a little bit more challenging for the investigators. The other variant allows you to play with event tiles, and in the beginning of the game you just add those event tiles and give it to the forensic investigator, and when that happens they are going to read the card and do what it says. It adds just a little bit more flavor to the base game. There are 2 characters that I usually wait to play with after my first or second game with people, and those characters are the accomplice and the witness. Those are characters that make the game just a little bit more challenging as well and creates a couple more steps for the students to learn. The very first time that I play with my students, I make sure to include just the 3 basic characters, the forensic scientist, the investigators, and the murderer, just to make things a little bit more streamlined and easy to learn that first game. I really hope you enjoy incorporating Deception, Murder in Hong Kong into your curriculum, because there are, again, so many wonderful lessons built into this game, and I just know your students are going to engage 100% with this game. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching!